Toilets never flush up. Grace and peace, everyone. We've reached the final part of this 5-part series on discovering the Christ-filled life and having that Spirit-inspired speech, really focusing on how the emphasis here in Ephesians is where if we've been born again, it changes how we talk. And that's always talking to others. And so when we think about sin and what we want to be delivered from, we close by remembering and noting the downward spiral of sin. And much like a toilet, sin never flushes up. It always goes one direction like a toilet. It always brings us down. It weights us down. It pulls us down. And it's here in Ephesians that the Lord uses Paul to try to get us to understand this so that we can always be trying to go the other way. But the only way up is away from sin and towards God. And we can only do that through Christ. So now in Ephesians 4:18, when we are told having the understanding darkened, describing now those who have been left or lost in sin, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their heart. This is a brutal description of what life is like apart from God, but it's necessary. It helps us to get an idea of where we don't want to be. Because if I go backwards, I'm always going to be going downward. And even though it might be comfortable, I will be compromising my future because remember, the trajectory is always down. That's why when we read chapter 4 and verse 19, notice the digression, not progression, the regression, where it says, who being past feeling have given themselves over unto lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. You notice the compound fracture there? Lasciviousness, uncleanness, greediness. It's a hard word to say, but it's even harder to live that way. The digression or the regression that happens when we are in sin. And that's why we're always asking God to pull us out, pull us up. This is the reality of sin. And when we see this regression and this pulling backwards, I hope it raises an awareness of why we want to make sure that we are always, Lord, bring me up, bring me out, move me forward. Because like I said, backwards might be comfortable, but it's not convenient. Because finally here in Jude chapter 1, verse 11, look at the woe. Look at the not the woe, but the warning where it says, woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain and ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward and perished in the gainsaying of Korah or Korah. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram back from the Old Testament. Cain, we know from the very beginning. Then we see Balaam in the middle, that backward prophet who tries to compromise Israel in order to complement his bank account. This is why when Jude is speaking of all those who've made a mess, all those who we can look and say they are probably not going to be in the kingdom, notice what direction they always go. Backwards. The Lord wants to work in the total opposite direction. He wants us to go forward. He wants us to grow forward. There's only one way to grow, and it's forward. And when we know now that I've made myself available to God, and I've received the gift of righteousness through Christ, my life now, my shaped life, my Christ-shaped life now is always going to be one of progression. That doesn't mean easy. Because even a mountain climber is progressing, right? They're onward and they're upward. But is it easy? So don't use the level of comfort as your barometer for whether or not it's God's direction. Sometimes God's direction is hard, but it's always holy. And it's always peace. And at the end, it's joy. I want to encourage us and even to find that joy in that process of the upward, not spiral, but the upward staircase, climbing Jacob's ladder. Who was that ladder? It was Christ. And just as the angels descend upward and backward to minister to us, they are always going up towards God, but they come back to grab us. They come back to pull us up and say, come on, you can do this, Jacob. My bad. You can do this, Israel. You can do this, Chris. You can do this, and you fill in the blank. God is calling us out of the spiral of sin and into the staircase of righteousness. And today, if we hear his voice and we recognize these who've been left in the path as warnings for us, we can know They got left behind, but God's going to lead me onward. And if we can be led onward, we can grow in our speech. Don't worry about your mistake. Fall on the grace of God. Don't worry about the stumble you may have had a couple of weeks ago. Fall on the grace of God. And when we fall on the grace of God, we always end up falling forward. And we're able to see our lives day by day shape more and more like Christ. And we actually start talking like him too, because we're loving like him too. And we actually start talking like him too, because we're loving like him. I hope this series has encouraged us, helped us to see what God wants to do with us. And he wants to work around in here, right? Work in our mouths, because he's renewing our mind.